Welcome to Sunday Sermons. Let's grab our Bibles and open up to the book of Numbers, chapter 14, verses 1 through 19. And I'll read verses 3 and 4 for us now, as we prepare to hear from Tim Latham as he helps us continue in our summer sermon series titled, In the Wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us into this land to fall by the sword? Our wives and our little ones will become a prey. Would it not be better for us to go back to Egypt? And they said to one another, let us choose a leader and go back to Egypt.
My name is Tim. I have been on staff for about a year at this point. Maybe some of you all feel like you know me by now. Others may not feel that way. But either way, we're kind of getting past the honeymoon stage. The return window has expired. So I think it's okay to admit some things, to be open and honest. And one of the things that I'd like to admit, that I have what I like to call an eclectic personality. Other people like to call it weird. Last week, I was talking to Emma and some of the interns before church, and Emma was teasing me because I'm usually pretty relaxed. But on Sundays, when I can't get my hands on the iced coffee and the little mints that sit on the welcome desk, I kind of lose it. I kind of freak out a little bit because I need the right ratio of copious amounts of iced coffee and several of these mints to counteract the coffee breath to engage on a Sunday morning. It's a whole thing. And I told them that at this point in my life, I have given up on being normal and embraced being weird. And Emma said, you've done a really good job of that. But she is 100% right. And I realized that this week. See, in my office, I have a prop this morning. I have a bat. I have this baseball bat that I keep in my office. Tommy's brother, Michael, gave it to me 14 years ago when we lived together. Because have y'all seen the movie A Few Good Men? So one of my favorite movies, in that movie, Tom Cruise's character has this bat that he keeps with him. It's his thinking bat. It helps him to think through legal arguments. I use mine to think through sermons or everything else that I do. And so he gave me this bat, and he wood burned a Bible verse into it, and I've had it with me for 14 years. And people on staff will tell you, sometimes I'm holding my office, sometimes I'm walking the hallways with it in a way that seems slightly intimidating, but I have this bat with me. And this week, when I came into my office, I realized that a chunk of the bat was missing. While I was out of town, somehow a sliver of this wooden bat had broken off. And I know, rationally, that this doesn't really matter, that it's just a little sliver of wood from this bat that I keep in my office. I know that the Spirit is not going to decide not to be with Tim as he's writing a sermon just because the balance of the bat is off in the way that I hold it. But apparently a part of my brain does not believe that. A part of my brain thinks that this bat is very important to everything I do, and especially to writing a sermon, because I spent an embarrassing amount of time this week looking up how to repair the bat, how to replace the bat, how much it would cost for me to buy this Javier Baez maple bat that's been game used from a Play It Against Sports in Georgia and overnight ship it to Williamsburg. And in that moment, I realized that Emma was probably right about me. Now, this is a silly example of a much more serious truth that's true for all of us in different ways, that we all have this propensity, this idea that we will rewrite history, we will rewrite our memories, we will deceive ourselves in a way that reflects our own worldview. To think that we are the main character, that we are responsible for all of the good things in our life, that we're not responsible for any of the bad things in our life, that we earned everything we have by pulling ourselves up by our own bootstraps. We like to imagine that the holy God views things the same way that we do, that he fits into our personal priorities, our political preferences, our plans for our lives. When the truth is that we are broken, we are selfish, we are faithless, and our allegiances are temporary and fleeting, while God is God. He is good and faithful. He is just and merciful. He is holy and loving always. This is what we see in our text today, that every act of rebellion against God starts by forgetting who God is and how he has been faithful again and again and again. Last week, Dale preached from Numbers 13 about the 12 spies that were sent into Canaan and how they came back with a bad report from the land. This promised land was plentiful, but it was already occupied by giants, by enemies, by certain death if they crossed into it. And over the next 2 weeks, we're looking at the next chapter, chapter 14, which is a chapter of responses. First, we see how the people respond to this bad report by rebelling against God. Then Moses responds by interceding with God on their behalf. God responds with both mercy and justice, and then the people respond to God's judgment by rebelling again. This week we're focused on the first half, where Israel rejects not only the promised land, but the God who promised it in the first place. Numbers 14 reveals a truth. The Israelites, that you, that me, that we rebel against God when we forget the God who has always been faithful. We're going to look at that in 3 parts this morning. The forgetful rebel, the faithful remember, and God remains. So we have spent about a year walking the Exodus road together, studying Exodus. Israel spent about a year actually walking the road, actually living this out. A year focused on one story, one mission from God to rescue his people from Egypt and to bring them here to the land that was promised to Abraham back in Genesis. Numbers 13 and 14, it seems like the end of a long road. They are right on the doorstep between the road between and the road in, right on the doorstep of the land of the milk and honey, and this is where everything falls apart. It's almost fallen apart before. We've seen how the people have grumbled again and again. We saw how they committed idolatry, and God threatened to take it away from them after at Exodus 32 to 34, when Moses was up on Mount Sinai and came down, and the people convinced Aaron to craft a golden calf so they could worship. And this seems like another in the long line of temptations. But we actually can see this is escalating, that it's not just complaining about food anymore. It's not complaining about the leadership. It has become something much more serious. A rejection of the promised land, a renunciation of the Exodus rescue plan, a rebellion against God himself. The people are weeping about how hopeless things look. They're complaining about God's guidance. They're despairing life itself. They're questioning God's love for them. They're doubting God's promises and his ability to fulfill them. And they're taking over the planning themselves. Why? Why has this escalated to the point of destruction? Now, at first glance, the problem seems to be fear, that after the bad report, the Israelites are concerned about their family, about their livelihood when they enter into the land of Canaan. But fear is not the disease, it's a symptom. The problem here is not that the giants are too big, but that the Israelites' memory, their view of God, is now too small. They had forgotten God's faithfulness, that he sent Moses to them when they were slaves in Egypt, that he brought plagues upon Pharaoh to liberate them, that he allowed the 10th plague to pass over them based on the blood of the Lamb, that he parted the Red Sea, that he shook the mountain, that he provided manna from heaven, water from a rock, and that he dwelled with them, coming down on the mountain, coming down in the cloud, into the tabernacle, into the ark, leading them from victory to victory and keeping them safe. And Israel just forgot. Despite God's constant faithfulness, continuous provision, and repeated overcoming of seemingly impossible odds, Israel remembers God throughout the Exodus road as unreliable, as untrustworthy, even as unloving. We see this in verse 3. Why is the Lord bringing us back into this land to fall by the sword? Our wives and little ones will become a prey. Got a quick pastoral trivia question for you. Does anyone know how many times the Israelites ask if God is trying to kill them in the Exodus narrative? Anybody? 12. That's a lot. No, not 12. It's 4. It's 4. It's very anticlimactic after the 12 guess. That would have been a better answer. Should have workshopped that part. Okay. First, at the Red Sea, before God parts it. Secondly, at Marah, before God provides the manna and the quail. And then at Rephidim, in Exodus 17, before God gives them the water. And then here at Kadesh, before they were about to enter into the promised land. Each of those times, when the odds seem stacked against them, they ask if God is trying to kill them. If there weren't enough graves in Egypt, they start to think that God doesn't love them at all. They doubt who he is and whether he cares about them. They forget what we just sang, the VBS song, that God loves us. They have forgotten the plot. This isn't a problem of fear anymore. It's a lack of faith. It's a lack of theology. It's a lack of understanding who God is and how he cares for his people. And it causes them to reject everything about God's rescue and redemption. They want to reverse the Exodus. They want a new leader. They want to give away the hope of the promised land to return to slavery in Egypt. They want to leave the God who has led them and protected them and go back to slavery to Pharaoh. Gregory of Nyssa was a 4th century theologian who summarized, abandoning their hope for better things, they reviled Moses and God himself. They have given up hope. They have turned against God. They want to go back to Egypt. This is not just a problem for the Israelites. It's a problem that Paul addressed in Romans 1 as well. He says, for although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal men and birds and animals and creeping things. The problem is not fear. It's not ignorance. They knew God. They just decided that something else deserved their trust more. And that's what's happening here in Numbers 14 as well. It's not a lack of knowledge, but a functional forgetting of who God is and exchanging him for the illusion that they might know better. It's a problem for Israel. It's a problem for the church in Rome, and it's a problem for us today. We may not be saying that we want to go back to Egypt, but we do struggle with the same sort of temptation where we want to go back against God's will for our lives because we think that on some level we know better than God. We might think things like, I know God calls us to forgive, but he doesn't really get what this person did to me. I know God says generosity is a good thing, but I really need to prioritize my long-term comfort instead of someone else's needs. Or I know that the Bible says not to do this thing, but I really want to do this thing. Or I think I need to do this thing. Or everyone else is doing this thing and they get away with it. Every but is another version of it would be better for us to go back to Egypt. It's an act of forgetfulness and an act of rebellion. But in the text, there is a better response as well. And that's our second point. The faithful remember. Dale pointed out last week that the first 10 spies exaggerated parts of the report, including the Nephilim. But I think the difference between the two responses is not really about the content of the information, but more about how that information is interpreted. Because the first 10 spies agreed the land was exceedingly good. Caleb and Joshua, they don't deny that the Canaans were large or that the cities were fortified. They agree on broad swaths of the report, but they view the situation completely differently. For Caleb and Joshua, their knowledge of God colors their view of everything else. It doesn't matter how big the enemy is or how many they are or if the opposition seems impossible, because they remember that God is in the business of doing the impossible. That list of miraculous feats along the Exodus road, they are all impossible. The plagues, the parting of the Red Sea, the provision of food in the desert. Joshua and Caleb are not pretending that the giants don't exist, but they are trusting that God is bigger than anything that they could face. I was talking to Tommy about the text this week, and he pointed out that it's not just about trusting God when things seem difficult or impossible, but trusting God when he wants to put us in situations that are difficult or seem difficult or impossible, so that we can put our trust in him and face the giants in front of us. That's part of who God is. That's part of his plan for his people. God could have created a paradise in Canaan that was ripe for the taking, where the land was plentiful and easy, a place that wouldn't be hard on the people, a place that was empty and there was no opposition. But if he did that, it would not have required a deep trust in God. It wouldn't have required a humility in the Israelites' capacity to do it themselves. It wouldn't have required them to continue to rely on God's presence. Even the fact that God told Israel to send out the spies. God knew who was in the land, but he wanted them to know that the trials were not over, that the time of trust was not done just because they were coming out of the wilderness and into the promised land. God wanted them to see what Caleb and Joshua saw, a challenge, a need to live out their identity as God's people who remain in God's presence, who follow God's ways, whose exploits and faith testify to God's love. Last week, Dale said, when we distrust God, it's not because the challenges are too big, it's because our view of God is too small. The spies believed that the giants were stronger than Israel. Israel believed that the giants were stronger than God. That's the actual sin at play. Giving up, having no faith in the God who has proven that he has that strength, that he is faithful. And so Caleb is not being cheerfully optimistic. He is being faithful. He sees the giants, but has a larger understanding of who God is. Which of these stories are you telling yourself? When you look at your life, do you tell yourself that you are beset with giants? Do you deceive yourself that God must have abandoned you or decided he doesn't love you because of the situation you find yourself in? Do you search around for someone or something else that could provide an easier way? Or will you do the work to remember that God is with us in the darkest, in the saddest, in the most hopeless times in our lives, that God has been faithful before and he will be faithful again no matter what we face? I say do the work because whatever you keep staring at starts to look a little bit bigger. That's what we see here. The Israelites, because they didn't remember what God had done, their lack of faith, their forgetfulness, it allowed them to focus on the giants, to focus on the obstacles, to magnify the giants until the God seemed too small to deal with the problems. And going back to Egypt seemed better by comparison. But in the same way, faith magnifies the God that it remembers. It magnifies the God that it focuses on. Caleb and Joshua remembered how God works. They kept their focus on him, so the giants seemed to be an insignificant hurdle in God's plan for his people. We need to have a big enough view of God to trust him in all situations. The choice in front of us is simple enough to see, even if it's really hard to live out. Will you rebel? Will you let yourself be deceived by the trials and temptations of this world? Or will you remember the God who is always faithful? It's our third point this morning. the God who is always faithful, the God that remains the same. Caleb's clarity on who God is doesn't just impact how he sees the land of Canaan. It also gives him the right perspective on this rebellion. See, he and Joshua, they don't see this as another time of complaining. When Israel starts to push against God's desire for them to go into the land, Caleb and Joshua tear their clothes. Moses and Aaron fall on their faces. They are grieving. They are mourning. They are petitioning. They recognize that Israel must be punished because they remember who God is and the fact that a holy God cannot simply shrug off rebellion. We see this truth in verses 11 and 12, where God pronounces his initial verdict on Israel. There's a couple things here I want to point out, that there's two things happening simultaneously in this initial judgment by God. One is that God is repeating an offer to Moses from when Moses interceded back in Exodus to reject these people and to start over again with Moses and a new nation, letting Moses enter into the promised land. But secondly, that offer also follows a form that we see often, or not often, but several times in the Old Testament, where God will pronounce a verdict on a guilty and sinful people and then allow a space for an intercessor to step up and advocate on behalf of the sinful people. We see this in Genesis when Abraham intercedes for Sodom and Gomorrah. We see it in Exodus 32 and 34 when Moses intercedes for the people. And again, Moses does not abandon the Israelites, but pleads on their behalf. But when we look at how he frames his intercession, I think something really interesting happens, because his plea, Moses' prayer for grace and mercy, is not based on Israel at all. Moses doesn't make any excuses for the people. He doesn't say, they mean well, they were trying hard, they're basically good people. But every sentence is about God. It's about God's glory and character. It's about God's word and promises. It's about God's steadfast love and covenant faithfulness. Israel's hope was never found in the strength of Israel's faith, but in the steadfastness of God's character. Israel's hope was never found in the strength of Israel's faith, but in the steadfastness of God's character. This is huge because it's true for us as well. We are not saved because we are always obedient or moral or we perform well or that we are particularly lovable, but because God is who he says he is, and God does not change. Israel's rebellion doesn't make God more judgmental. Moses' intercession doesn't make God more merciful. He is always both. God knows us, and God knows himself. Think about the way that Moses asks for this intercession. He goes back to Exodus 34. It says, this is who you are, the Lord who is slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, forgiving iniquity and transgressions, but by no means clearing the guilty. That reminder is not for God. It's for Israel. It's for Moses himself. It's for us. When everything around us changes, when we change ourselves, when we flit back and forth between remembering and rebelling, God does not. We can trust God, to be holy and just, to be loving and merciful, all at the same time. And that's what happens. God's punishment here is just and merciful. God gives this generation what they were asking for. He refuses entrance into the land. He casts them out back through the wilderness towards the Red Sea, back towards Egypt, where they said they wanted to go. But the nation is not destroyed. The younger generation will suffer because they'll have to wait 40 years for the older generation to die. But God has not abandoned Israel. And if we remember who God is and the way that Caleb and Joshua do and the way that Moses and Aaron do in this text, then we can see this punishment from God as holy, just, loving, and merciful. And if that's true here in Numbers 14, it's even more clear at the cross. Because the fullest revelation of God's justice and mercy is not found in the prayer of Moses, but in the person of Jesus. Christ is the true intercessor who exemplifies God's justice, God's love, God's mercy and holiness. He is the character of God made manifest, made flesh, and he enables us, a broken, stiff-necked, forgetful, rebellious people, to enter into the promised land of God's holy presence forever. The people in Numbers 14 are right at the cusp of the land that was promised to Abraham back in Genesis. But if you remember God's covenant with Abraham, when they got to the ceremony where the two parties would walk through an aisle of torn animals, this was the signing of the contract. And you're saying, if I don't live up to my end of the covenant, let me be torn apart like these carcasses are. And God waited until Abraham fell asleep, and then God passed through the sacrifices himself. God knew that we could not keep our end of the covenant. He knew that we were faithless. He knew that we were broken. He knew that we were forgetful and rebellious. And so God put himself on the line. Our hope is not in our ability to be faithful, but in God's covenant faithfulness, that God made the covenant, put his skin in the game, and then Jesus is the one who ultimately paid that price, who paid the cost for our sinfulness on the cross, where God's holiness and God's love meet without either one of them being diminished. Just like Israel, our hope has never been in the strength of our faith, but in the steadfastness of who God is. How you remember God determines how you respond to him. Israel had a selective memory. They forgot the bad parts about Egypt and the good parts about God, so they rebelled. Joshua and Caleb remembered God's faithfulness, so they trusted. Moses remembered God as both gracious and just, so he interceded. And through it all, God remained exactly who he had revealed himself to be. Even today, even knowing what Jesus did on the cross, even having experienced it, like Paul says in Romans, we still face the same temptation. We still face the same choice. Do we rebel or do we remember? I spent all week worried about this tiny chunk on the end of my bat. Israel stood at the edge of the promised land and forgot about the God who turned day into night, who parted the sea, who shook the mountain, who brought bread from heaven and water from a rock. It's amazing what we remember and what we forget. Tommy's song, based on Exodus 15, the Song of Moses, marked our year of studying the Exodus way. And this is the song that the Israelites forgot, of how God had been faithful along the whole journey. This is the song that we have to remember, to trust God even when things appear to be hopeless, when others might believe we're being foolish, when God's ways contradict our own thoughts and desires. We need to remember who he is, what he has done, and how he loves you. My friend Michael, when he gave me the bat, he engraved it with a Bible verse that says, Hebrews 13:7, which says, remember your leaders who have spoken God's word to you. As you carefully observe the outcome of their lives, imitate their faith. And the next verse, verse 8, says, Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Our memories can be unreliable. Our emotions can be unstable. Our fears can be deafeningly loud. But Jesus is the same. Yesterday, today, always. And the most important thing you can do with your life to not make the mistake the Israelites did is to trust in the one who never changes.
Thanks for joining us today. Here at the chapel, we are all about making disciples of Jesus Christ. We hope you will join us as we listen for God to speak in the wilderness and allow him to shape our lives through wilderness preparation, temptation, and invitation.